Dave, I'm going to stay on this mic because my other mic is dead. Good morning. Is anybody else dragging today? Do you feel like that 1 hour is so precious and when you lose it, if you're like me, you stay up even later on the night when you lose an hour of sleep and then you feel really groggy the next day? Is anybody feeling like groggy? A couple? Two of us? Our theme for this year is the heart of man plans his way, but the Lord establishes his steps. And we've been talking about how important and vital it is to make plans. We have to have some kind of a plan to move forward in life, to move forward as a church, to move the kingdom forward. There has to be a plan. And so our heart makes those plans, but God is the one who establishes our steps. Plans change constantly. They're kind of fluid, but that doesn't mean we don't make plans. We still have to make plans. And we've been talking about a process of loving neighbors, getting into people's homes, getting them into our homes, loving on our neighbors, and then moving those people to loving God, getting them to worship and fall in love with God, and then moving them, as well as moving all of us, into serving others, getting into our community and serving people. Does anybody feel that life is just messy? That the more you live life, right, it's a little bit messy and complicated. This is an interesting graph, I think, that shows life. It looks like somebody just kind of puked onto a piece of paper. This was actually developed in 1999. It's called the Sinefin framework. It was created in 1999 by David Snowden, who worked for IBM Global Services. And he was talking about how there are kind of these 5 different frameworks. And I'm not going to go through, and I, to be honest, didn't really put a whole lot of study into understanding the Sinef framework. But I just thought this was an interesting graph to show people that life is really messed up. It's really complicated. And he was applying this to the workforce and saying that, you know, like kind of in the center, there's just in people's lives, there's disorder and there's chaos. You can see the one side is chaos. And he said, so if we're being kind of strategic about things, we'll move people from complete disorder where people are fighting and, you know, I don't know if any of you have ever worked in a place that's just been like disorder everywhere. Yeah, some of us probably have, where you look around and you're like, how's this place still open? And then there's chaos. You know, you kind of move people to chaos, and that's a little bit more ordered, but it's like almost strategic chaos. And then he says you can move people from chaos to complex, where things are still kind of bogged down and complex, and life is just tough and hard, and people are still fighting. And then you move from complex to complicated, and then you move into simple. Well, when you move into the simple category, just when you think that you've got it, and there's this aha moment, and I'm just going to simplify, right? KISS, keep it simple, silly. He's like, it doesn't work that way. So this little thing on the right side, when you believe all is simple, everything is ordered, past success makes you invulnerable to future failure, and then it says think again, and it has the hands around the neck, kind of choking that guy. It says before you know it, the chaotic domain grabs you by the throat and drags you into a crisis. Life happens. Life is tough. Life is complicated. And I think that's where we find ourselves. Last week I kind of put those different things up and talked about my upbringing where I was taught that everything was sinful. I mean, everything was a problem and sinful, from wearing shorts to you name it. And it was considered sinful, and you were a bad person. And that kind of led to this, leads to this life of shame and secrecy and all those things. And so the real question is, what do we do when we really are faced with crisis? What do we do when things in our life blows up and it's not, wearing shorts? That's like, for me, that was the big crisis. Like if you got caught wearing shorts when it was not shorts time at college, they had designated time periods where you were allowed to wear shorts. But other than that, you had to wear long jeans. And in 110-degree weather in Arkansas, it was not very fun. So those were considered like the big crises when I was in college. And then I moved out of college and I realized like there is genuine trauma in people's lives. And a lot of times life looks like this. So what do we do with that? How do we help people through those periods of trauma? Well, for one thing, it takes a whole lot of humility. We have got to remain humble if we're going to help other people make it through their trauma and manage their trauma. What I've found in the work that I do with advocacy is that very few churches are trauma informed. In other words, they know nothing about trauma, about what trauma does to the body, about what trauma does to the psyche. They don't understand that when people experience traumatic events in their life, it changes their mind, it changes the brain chemistry, it changes everything about their life. Every facet of their life is changed forever. And so it takes a great deal of humility to really help people walk through trauma. And so today, this is what we're going to talk about. Dave read earlier, and we're going to kind of unpack this here in a little bit, but Dave read from 2 Corinthians chapter 12, and prior to this, Paul's talking about this great revelation that he had. He had this magnificent, wonderful, out-of-this-world revelation, and he says it was so great I can't really talk about what it was. And he's kind of tempted to boast about it, but then he takes a step back and he's like, no, I'm not going to boast about that. And so here's what he says. Though if I should wish to boast, I would not be a fool, for I would be speaking the truth. But I refrain from it, so that no one may think more of me than he sees in me or hears from me. Do you ever know people who kind of puff themselves up and like you can just tell that they're exaggerating about their lives? And you're like, dude, you're not really that great. Your story sounds good, but I know you. So Paul's saying, I'm going to refrain from that. I'm not going to tell you about all these magnificent things because I want you to not think anything more of me than what you see in me or hear from me. In other words, Paul's saying, I am who I am. What you see is what you get. At verse 7, so to keep me from becoming conceited or puffed up or arrogant, to keep me from becoming arrogant or conceited, because of the surpassing greatness of the revelations, a thorn was given me in the flesh. This word for thorn, it's the only time that it's used in all of the Bible. It's the only occurrence. And it means something like a sharp stake that somebody jabs into your side for the purpose of making you feel excruciating pain. A thorn was given me in the flesh, a messenger of Satan to harass me. That word for harass, I want to break that out. I think harass is kind of an unfortunate translation. Here's what the word really means. It means to buffet. It means to strike with intention, to give full force, to knock somebody down over and over and over and over again. This is not a one-time strike. It's a buffet. So here's one definition, the verb form, especially of wind or waves, to strike repeatedly and violently, to batter. The rough seas buffeted the coast. Merriam-Webster defines it this way. To strike sharply, especially with the hand. To strike repeatedly, to batter. The waves buffeted the shore. To drive, force, move, or attack. To attack by, or as if by repeated blows. So it's this intentional hitting somebody over and over and over again. And Paul's saying, this is what Satan's doing to me. It's this sharp stake that somebody intentionally whittled to make it even sharper and to jab it into my side and to hit me over and over and over and over again. And Paul's begging God to stop. Now, we don't know what this messenger of Satan was. I've heard people talk about this as a temptation. And they said, well, maybe Paul had some temptation in his life and Satan was just using that temptation to knock him down. Other people think this was some kind of physical ailment. Because sometimes a thorn in the flesh was kind of, something that meant I had some physical ailment or some physical problem. So we don't know if he had some painful disease. Some people think it was his bad eyesight from when he was stoned and left for dead. Paul writes about his bad eyesight. We don't really know, but we know whatever it was, it sounds painful, it sounds miserable, and it sounds traumatic. And there's no stopping it. There's not any letting up from it. Do you ever feel that in life? Do you ever feel like life is just kicking your butt all around and there's no stopping it? You can't get away from it. That no matter what you do, it seems like it's the wrong thing, or it seems like it's going to hurt somebody, or it seems like it's going to hurt you, or it's going to knock you down even farther. No matter what you do, you can't get out of that cycle. That's what we call trauma. Going back to our text, Paul says, this stake was given me in the flesh, a messenger of Satan to buffet me, to strike me, to harass me, to keep me from becoming conceited. 3 times I pleaded with the Lord about this. That word for plead means to beg for mercy. It's getting down on your hands and knees. It's not like asking God. He's not asking for a favor. He's not like, God, can you do me a solid? He's begging God for mercy. That it should leave me. Verse 9, but he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you. The word for grace means to have favor upon somebody, to look at somebody favorably and to say, you are my child. I don't know how many of us feel that way in the middle of just getting beat up and smacked around by life. When you're being buffeted by Satan, and I'm not talking about, like not finding a parking spot. Like I've heard Christians talk about that. Like, Satan's really after me. I couldn't find my car keys. I'm like, yeah, that's just you being dumb. That's not Satan beating you up. Trust me. When you're being harassed, when you're being slammed, struck, beaten, buffeted by life, when you genuinely feel attacked, I think a lot of times we just want to give up. When you run to other people and people say, well, you just need to have more faith, I think sometimes we beg God for mercy, and I've seen people beg God for mercy, and I've seen people who are literally on the cusp of complete collapse. I mean, literal physical collapse, spiritual collapse in life in general. And I've seen people beg God for mercy, and then somebody in their family dies. Or a friend dies. And I think this is that buffeting that Paul's talking about. It's this being struck over and over and over and over and over again. And God comes back and he says, my grace, my favor is on you, and that's sufficient for you. For my power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore, I will boast all the more gladly of my weaknesses, so that the power of Christ may rest upon me. For the sake of Christ, then, I am content with weaknesses, insults, hardships, persecutions, and calamities. For when I am weak, then I am strong. I've heard so many Christians talk so badly about people who face all kinds of weaknesses. I got a drink. My allergies, spring is coming. I can feel it. I hear somebody snotting over there. Spring's coming, Coco. Going back to what I talked about last week, I was taught that everything was black and white. That if people were experiencing hardships, it was their fault. They dug their own grave. They may as well lie in it. I was taught this is right, this is wrong. Here's the list. And if you do anything on the side of wrong, then it's your fault if life blows up. Then that's your problem. It's that simple view of life that doesn't factor in trauma. It doesn't factor in life in general. It doesn't factor in all these problems that we face. And I'll give you an example. And I mean, this is kind of I think, a public elephant in the room, and I don't mention this to shame anybody, but it's in the newspaper, and I told Eden, you're going to get to school on Monday, and you're going to hear kids talking about this, but her principal was charged this weekend with a DUI. There was a car accident. She crashed into somebody. Blood alcohol content was super high. It's all over the newspaper. Our superintendent she was interviewed and asked what's the school going to do about it. So, it's this big old mess. The old me, the way I was taught, the way I was trained was, well, you idiot, you drink, you drive, you face the consequences. The new me, who looks at some of these things and says, all right, what's going on? Not that drinking, driving is ever okay, but what else is going on, right? What's going on in the lives of people? When you're 51 years old, you're not an 18-year-old who's partying and sneaking into grandpa's liquor cabinet or whatever. When you're 51 years old, you're in your 50s, and you're still wildly drinking. There's usually something else going on. And so I thought this was kind of interesting. And I'm not psychoanalyzing anybody, but I'm talking about life sometimes kicks our butts. Life sometimes is really difficult, and we've got to look beyond the immediate facts and say sometimes people are just being buffeted. They're being knocked down over and over and over and over again. So what's the Christian response when we see things like this? This is by Oxford Clinical Psychology. 10 common reactions to trauma. Number 1, anxiety and fear. Panic attacks, chronic anxiety, just feeling anxious in general. Number 2, re-experiencing trauma. This is through unwanted thoughts, flashbacks, nightmares, etc., etc. Anytime that people experience real trauma in their life, a lot of times it comes out in these forms. Which can lead to increased vigilance. Always looking around, who's going to mess my life up next, or where's the next shoe going to drop? What's going to happen next in my life? It's this increased vigilance, which leads to irritability, impatience. Always being on high alert leads to being irritable, impatient with people, impatient with yourself. Another one is avoidance, avoiding situations that are triggering. I know so many survivors of abuse who have so many triggers in their life, and they say the only way that I can try to avoid being triggered is to not go to these places or not be in a situation where my abuse took place. Oftentimes that's at church. Church is a trigger. So avoidance. People who've experienced trauma experience anger. Sometimes this anger wells up and comes out of nowhere. I got an email yesterday from somebody who wrote me a wonderful email. It was a very long email. And she said, I listened to your last podcast. And she said, I agree with everything you said, but I had an unexpected response. And it was this response of this anger that just came out of nowhere. And I'm trying to process that. And I hope that you'll talk about this in another podcast, because I don't think I was alone. It's these huge emotional outbursts of anger. People who have experienced trauma experience guilt and shame. They feel like somehow that the trauma was their fault, that they were participants in some way. People who've experienced trauma experience grief and depression. Why can't I just feel good? The sun's shining. Everybody around me is happy. What is wrong with me? Why can't I feel joy in my life? Trauma has a response where self-image and views of the world are more negative after experiencing trauma. I'm ugly. I'm dumb. I'm fat. I'm skinny. I'm whatever it is. It's the negative self-image and negative views of the world. Everybody's out to get me. Nobody's trustworthy. I'll never find another good friend again. And then sexual relationships suffer. Because there's a lack of trust, intimacy becomes a reminder of the assault. And then finally, increased use of alcohol and substance to sleep, just to fall asleep, or to block painful memories in the past. And so I bring this up and I mention this to say, like, what Paul's experiencing, I think, my opinion, is that Paul's experiencing some kind of trauma. There's some kind of trauma event, and Paul's begging God to take this stuff away. I don't want to think about it. I don't want to feel this. I don't want to experience all these emotions that come with it. Please take this away. I'm being slammed. I'm being buffeted. I'm being hit over and over and over again. And God, please take it away. And God comes back and he says, Paul, you are enough for me. You're sufficient. God doesn't say, okay, let me remove that and put you on this easy path, and the rest of your life, because you're a Christian, you're going to experience all this joy that's overflowing, and you're going to, like, life is going to be great and fantastic. God doesn't say that. God takes Paul exactly where he is, and he says, Paul, you're suffering. I feel your pain. I feel what you're feeling, and you need to know my grace, my approval of you, my gift to you is sufficient. And Paul comes back and he says, so to all of you, I'm not going to hide from my pain. I'm not going to hide from my trauma. I'm not going to hide from these things. I'm going to step out there in spite of my weaknesses. And in fact, I'm going to brag about my weaknesses. I'm going to say, you know what? Yeah, I fell down. I stumbled. I experienced a setback. Paul talks about it in Romans 7. Paul talks about wrestling with sin. He says, I do the things that I don't want to do. The things that I should do, I don't do. And the things that I ought not to do, I do. Paul's not like, yeah, I'm a super Christian, man. Like, nobody should ever sin again. And if you do, then we're going to kick you out of the church. Paul doesn't say that. Paul says God takes us exactly where we are in our weaknesses, and God extends grace to us. God says, my grace, my gift, my approval of you is sufficient, Paul. I think that's so important to be a trauma-informed church and to help people who are wrestling with life and people who are struggling and people who are battling addictions and people who are experiencing all kinds of garbage in their life. I think a lot of times Christians look down the brim of their nose and they're like, well, how do you think you got in that situation? Right? That's our first response a lot of times when we're not trauma-informed. Trauma-informed churches come back, trauma-informed Christians come back and say, I don't know how you got here. Maybe you don't even know how you got here, but I'm going to sit with you and I'm going to help you try to understand. And you need to know that God accepts you exactly where you are. I'm not saying that everything you do in your life is right. But God accepts you where you are, and his grace is sufficient for you. I think people need to hear this message. People need to know that God's grace is sufficient for them. I'm going to close on that thought. I hope that as we go out this week, that when we witness people, experience people who've had all kinds of trauma in their lives, that we're more slow to speak and a lot quicker to listen. And that we point people to Jesus Christ and let them know God's grace is sufficient. If there's anybody who's not yet taken that step to put Christ on in baptism, or if anybody has prayer needs, you can come up. We're going to stand and sing this song together.